Welcome to Season 5 of Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Your Bird Story. I am joined by Eric Archer today, and I'm going to ask Eric to make his introductions.
Yeah, I'm coming to you from the Hudson Valley of New York. So I've lived in Ulster County, and I run a small art center in Putnam County. And I'm a wood carver, a musician, a naturalist, and a humble adventurer, I like to say. And Georgia and I crossed paths at the John Burroughs Awards. I was showing a trailer with a filmmaker friend of mine, Jesse Brown of Work in Progress Pictures, and we're following this inquiry, this love of not just the writings and the history of John Burroughs, the literary naturalists, but also kind of our own paths of living in the Hudson Valley and how this inquiry into the natural world just continues to reveal this larger ecology of life, as well as kind of reveal this inner process of where we see our kinship in the natural world and how that has in so many ways evolved over the past 150 years since Burroughs was writing, and how kind of the seeds of his writing can inform as well as support maybe what we see our place now in bringing people that might be very feeling separate from the natural world into this friendship, into this kinship.
So you use the word kinship, and I'm curious about what that looks like to you and how the word became a part of your vocabulary.
Yeah, great question. I think so much of the challenges now, for many years, you mentioned tangents, so I'll have fun bringing in some of the tangents. Over the past 12 odd years, I've worked with an older storyteller, and we work with old stories and mythologies and mythopoetics, but also the stories unfolding in the natural world and the stories unfolding in our own individual lives, how we separate them, how they mix. And I think, this term kinship is starting to place our own personal stories, which sometimes can be so focused on me, mine, I, sometimes woe is me, or oh, look at me, or all these things, of placing that back into the larger story of the natural world, teaching through stories, through the goldfinch song or the indigo bunting coming back here, right, as two birds that just kind of entered our little zone here by this art center where I am as seasonal migrants, but how we place our story back into the larger story of the family of life. And that starts to put into perspective what the human condition is and how we might start to think of our own family and looking out for our own kin as not just looking out for, say, our own human family or your human community, which would be an amazing thing if we were all working in that, with that priority, but also in this larger family of ecology and how this interdependence is very real. It's very scientific, chemical, physical, as well as it is genetic and spiritual and metaphoric.
Thank you for that. You mentioned two specific species as you were responding. And I guess I'll go ahead and ask you, because this just flows naturally, what's your relationship to birds?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is such a wonderful magic in the world of birds. I think, again, humans often engage the natural world through like a utilitarian perspective, right? How can I use this tree? I'm a woodworker, so I know that consciousness. And yet birds are so wonderful. I mean, I guess with the exception of poultry, fowl, and other ways that the agricultural industry intersects with birds. But for the most part, birds, we can't really use them as much as in so many ways we use other parts of the natural world. And so the ways that birds not only don't observe borders, how they can fill ecological niches in the lightest ways and are so resilient in that ways is constantly magical. Of course, the capability of flight is the ineffable thing that we humans have been envious of. But I think the birds are so much this whimsical expression of the ecology. And I was talking to a mycologist friend, and he was talking about, mushroom foraging and hunting for mushrooms. And he says, I'm not really looking for the mushrooms as much as I'm looking for the actual habitat where I know that the mushrooms will be part of that community. And I think of birds in the same way. I think one could map it to a lot of the natural world, where I can't quite remember who's attributed with the quote, but maybe it's John Muir, maybe not Burroughs, but he said you pull on one thread of the ecological web and you find it connected to every single other part of the web. So the idea that a particular warbler, where do you draw the distinction of the bird itself to its habitat, even migrationally? And so seeking a particular habitat is a way of understanding the bird, or understanding the bird is actually understanding a particular part of a wetlands or a deep hardwood forest. That's kind of maybe one way that I've enjoyed the revealing of the bird community to me, as well as, the sonic component of the songs and how they change the dialects, right? So a Carolina wren sings with a slightly different accent, like in Ulster County than it does in Putnam County. And once, as a musician, I'm really tuned to that sound. It's a challenging practice, but it's such a wonderful way of studying design and geometry of sound. So,
yeah, the looking for the bigger picture of the habitat to find the species makes me think about some 20th century conservation that was really focused on the individual species. And when folks began to focus on the habitat, it then became the species of interest, but all the other animals and plants that are within that system that provide for that species of interest, and those creatures were getting initially lost in the focus on singular species. So, always being in tune to a larger picture. I think this is something that human people struggle with, right? We kind of like to drill down and essentialize things. It makes them easier to consume if you can just get just what you need and sort of get rid of everything else. Yeah, I definitely use that lens when I'm outdoors, sort of thinking about when I look at vegetation, I'll see or I'll hear this bird in this place. So you set your film in two locations, the Hudson Valley and the Catskills. I think that's correct. Could you describe for folks who are not familiar with those landscapes what they look and sound like?
The choice of setting it in the Hudson Valley and the Catskills, was not only connected to the history of John Burroughs, who was born and raised in the Catskills and then stayed in the Northeast in the Hudson Valley, lived on the Hudson River, but then, was constantly connected to the Catskills where he was born through his whole life, and used that kind of as his epicenter for nature studies and deep kind of observation of course, birds, but far beyond that. And I have lived in the Hudson Valley almost 15 years. And my friend Jesse, the filmmaker that I'm working with, was born and raised in Rosendale, the town that we both live in now. And so this kind of, time capsule of John Burroughs' writings, as well as our own particular connections to the natural world, spending a lot of time just having fun, adventuring in the natural world of the Hudson Valley and Catskills. And I think the Hudson Valley, of course, is the Hudson River Valley. The Catskills, I guess, could sort of be considered part of that on its eastern flank. I live in the Shawangunk Mountains, which is a different type of stone than the Catskills. The Catskills are bluestone and have a different type of ecology, a lot of overlaps, of course. And then the Shawangunks are kind of metaquartz granite. So they're very strong stone with small shards of crystal in them, and much smaller, but inviting and older in other ways. What's fun is we get to kind of juxtapose those two ecologies. And I think this kind of Hudson Valley Catskill region is an interesting mix. I used to run an old inn in North Carolina in the Southern Appalachians, and then I've spent a lot of time in Maine in the North Woods. And what's fun about the Hudson Valley is it kind of shares some overlaps from both of those two regions, right? The Southern Appalachians incredibly biodiverse, almost rainforest-esque in some ways, just the humidity, the richness, the biodiversity. And then the North Woods, this kind of austere, really beautiful, of course, evergreen conifers, but like the deep beech and birch woods. And the Hudson Valley Catskills kind of occupies a little bit of both of those. So you get species from the Southern Appalachians and also the North Woods. And that's particularly fun because you're finding those bioregions mix. The wonderful part about the Hudson Valley as well is there is a lot of the biodiversity of New York State that exists in the Hudson Valley and Catskill region. There also is this interesting intersection of culture where, of course, the huge metropolis of New York City has most recently been dependent on its water from the Catskill region, right? So that's part of what we were interested in our documentation and following some of Burroughs' writings, but also the flooding of the reservoirs in the Catskills that now provide the really amazing drinking water for New York City. So that's kind of the mashup of those. I was born and raised in the Bay Area of California. A couple twists of fate and unexpected turns. I ended up living in the Hudson Valley and I'm so grateful for it. I often say it's hospitable to a Californian.
I can see that.
Yeah. And I don't long to live back in California. I love to visit and I love it as my home landscape, but I'm very happy living here. And, I think what's so amazing about the Hudson Valley is it's not as dramatic as out west insofar as the high peaks and tree lines and that kind of alpine landscape. But, really true to Burroughs' spirit is that he really wanted to draw attention to these small little edges of nature that we're engaged with and not needing these vast landscapes, right? The interesting time, John Muir writing at the same time with John Burroughs, is John Muir was protecting, Yosemite and Half Dome and these places where you take any human, they would say, oh my gosh, this is wonderful, right? But when you see the maple tree in your backyard and the cardinal, it's easy to kind of say, oh, well, that's not really nature. Is that worthy of praise or reverence or these sorts of things? And so that was kind of the ways that Burroughs really brought home this idea that if we're going to engage and see the natural world in its true depth and breadth, we have to not just go to those sensational, pristine places. And now we see tourism all over the world where you can fly to the Himalayas or Patagonia. And these places are wonderful, of course. But I think what the natural world is beckoning and asking of us is to start to really see the intricacies and the mysteries that are just right before us, especially if we can read the finer print of the world, which John Burroughs, that would be his language and the finer print, right? So that's sort of the roundabout way about how it's set. And I think both Jesse and I fell in love with Burroughs' writings and that he's not as well known in historical literary tradition and naturalist tradition, although he was an incredibly well-known and famous writer, influential in his time. And I came across a quote recently of Burroughs where he said, the writings of Thoreau and Emerson led their readers to the men, where my writings have always led people into nature. I'm always happy about that. I've always feel successful in that work. And that has also contributed to almost the forgetting of John Burroughs' history, which I think he's okay with at some point. Where he's like, it's not really about me. I'm just trying to give you this friendly nudge. And so beautifully, his writings got into, early childhood education and textbooks. But he was wildly famous. I mean, he was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, Walt Whitman, and Edison, and Ford, and all these kind of, industrialists and politicians and famous artists. And yet he doesn't have the same kind of staying power in history. But his message was really kind of that communion with nature as opposed to his personal philosophy.
He seems, and without knowing very much about him, seems more of a humanist. John Muir was incredibly bigoted, envisioned California as a place free of indigenous people. It's perhaps a good thing for Burroughs' legacy that he isn't often placed with some of the leading figures of his time, especially as we sort of look back and interrogate really what they were writing about and the company they were keeping.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how do you, and I watched I think it's 5 minutes on Vimeo. What's your approach to telling the story of this person and the kind of nature connection he was promoting among people?
Initially, my friend and I had kind of thought about a drama story, and we've worked on a feature-length film script that would have a young poet, a modern New York City-based poet, meeting the spirit of John Burroughs, long story short, and kind of place Burroughs in a modern context, especially so playfully Burroughs was friends with Walt Whitman. He's not a poet, although he did write some poetry. He has very poetic philosophy, and he's just funny. Like reading his writings, I find myself laughing out loud, like how curious and accurately he describes these characters in the natural world. Like if one starts to develop a relationship with observing some of these species, birds in particular, but others, he really just kind of nails them in kind of a beautiful way of describing their personalities, which is so fun, right? As opposed to their scientific measurements or something. What we sort of shifted into from that feature-length film was trying to understand how we could work through some of Burroughs's writings. A lot of his essays take place in the Hudson Valley and the Catskills. So how to almost utilize his writing as a time capsule for what the landscape was like that he was observing at that point, and use it as a counterpoint to also just like explore what the landscape is like now as we're moving through it. How the development, we mentioned the flooding of the reservoirs. I love to be on the water. Of course, that's an amazingly dynamic part of the natural world. A lot of life congregates around the waterways, of course. It's such dynamic with the water table ebbing and flowing. And Burroughs didn't spend too much time on the water, but he wrote one essay about the Delaware River, which we're kind of using as maybe part of the roadmap. And so that type of historical reference, as well as kind of placing that in a modern context, which absolutely didn't account for indigenous wisdom in Burroughs's writings. It didn't account for the environmental degradation and modernization and forever chemicals and, these things that kind of were just starting to be in so many ways produced and utilized in that industrial era that Burroughs lived. And that's part of our curiosity with him as a historical figure, is that, one of the lines from that trailer is, he walked with poets, presidents, and robber barons, and we're walking in their visions and blind spots now. So this idea that somehow, John Burroughs was fundamentally inspiring to, say, Rachel Carson, who then went on to write Silent Spring, this amazing book, identifying DDT and bald eagles in a spring where there was no bird song. It was silent, envisioning the dystopian reality and real possibility of that through kind of this glorification of chemistry and a disconnection through the interdependence of our chemical impact. And so, Burroughs occupies this kind of interesting shadow space. He couldn't have known the fallout from this industrialization. And yet, what was his conversation like with Henry Ford, right, who has a very complicated past and impact, of course, and gifted Burroughs an automobile, right? One of the first naturalists had an automobile. There's a fascinating book about that process that Joan Burroughs, John Burroughs' great-granddaughter, who was at the award ceremony and now heads the John Burroughs Association, we kind of connected about, which kind of documents a couple road trips that Burroughs went on with Ford and Edison. And you're just kind of curious of somebody who created the light bulb, Edison, someone created the modern automobile. They're hanging out with one of the foremost naturalists. And what were their conversations about? Like, how did they situate kind of the environmental impacts of their work, or those that weren't having access to natural land, whether it be based on chemical and industrial impact or just social connection to nature, right? So yeah, I think Burroughs occupies that kind of complicated space and of that turn of the century where a lot of missed opportunities for foresight or just impossible foresight. It's hard to say how one would know all these impacts down the line. And yet somehow his writing still inspired the environmental and conservation movements. And that's a very fascinating kind of quality of his writing, which at the same time didn't carry as much of the spiritual and kind of maybe that kinship term that, say, indigenous wisdom understands and has been practicing for survival, right? And communion over millennia. And yet Burroughs was such an amazing observationalist, if that's a word, observer. And yet he captures the spirit of these creatures so beautifully. I mean, that's part of why I laugh out loud. It's like, oh my gosh, you saw that being so clearly and helped me see it too.
Can you provide an example of one of the bird personalities he writes so well about?
He speaks so beautifully about the different songs, right, that the birds will sing. But one that recently just made me laugh out loud. There's a particular type of bird called a thrasher, a brown thrasher. It's in the mockingbird family. And I just recently heard a really good thrasher singer. It's on the rail trail where I live and I ride my bike. And He says, I don't know what this bird has done, but it has a guilty conscience. Every time I see it, it's like running away as if it's done something wrong, like it's in trouble or something. And just this kind of level of like alertness and alarm that this bird will always have whenever I ride my bike by it or see it, in the woods, because it's usually on the edge of farm fields and open pasture. It's not like a woodland dweller. And so there's kind of like guilty conscience of the brown thrush. I know it might sound totally silly or nerdy, but it's totally the thing, because you never get a straight look at this bird because it's always just like running away, like it's just kind of like stole your lunch money or something, like it's done something very mischievous, and so that's one example, right? I'm thinking of his descriptions of like the winter wren, the nimbleness, tiny wren bird that will live through the winter. And, he describes this silvery song, fluted song that will just be this like amazing fluttering song, the winter wren song. I'll never forget the first time I heard it. And so these ways of kind of describing the song in metaphoric terms and how they move, right? When you know the wren family and how nimble they are and how shifty, nimble is the right word, right?
Yeah, and they're really powerful singers for such a tiny bird, relative to their body size. Their like song is so powerful.
And how they seem to arrive always in the nick of time, and kind of this amazing shifty and speed and yet arrival and stop. I appreciate that because it's just so, I'll use the term superhuman, right? Like to see another being move through space in this way it so attests to the mystery and to the complexity and just fascinating possibility of life and admiring each other, the natural world, of just how beautiful these things are.
Yeah. I have 2 more questions for you. Do you have a favorite book or essay written by Burroughs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have one that I have returned to, and a number of them actually, speaking about Burroughs' history and kind of placing him, he's got an interesting story of his wife was very religious and he wasn't, and how they met or didn't meet in that space. But he wrote one of his later essays that I really love and return to. It's not as much about nature observation, but it's called The Gospel of Nature. It's a very heartfelt essay and humorous. The setting for the essay is he writes that a Christian preacher wanted him to come to his congregation and preach about the gospel of nature. Mm-hmm. So, and he, again, I think was a self-proclaimed atheist. And yet, of course, you read his writings and he has this deep kinship and spiritual communion with the natural world. And you read his work on, say, geology, right? Grist of the gods, or these kind of things where he talks about the stone and how it's been ground down and just topsoil and stardust and all these kind of very amazing spiritual concepts that he's working with through the natural world. He lived at that interesting intersection of like Darwin's evolutionary theories coming to like really head-on collision with the religious movements of Christianity and rapture theory and all these things. And so, so he says, what does this preacher think that I'm going to tell his congregation that's going to make them feel confirmed in their faith? He's a little tongue-in-cheek, but then he takes the question very honestly. Like, what is the gospel? What have I learned from these decades of rambling in the woods with no real agenda other than just to see how the phoebe builds her nest, or, just to see these things unfold. And through that essay, he really brings back this joy and love. Like, he focuses on the love that he has for this family of ecology, I mean, that's my language, but he uses the word love, and that he really didn't have any utilitarian reason for doing it. It was just because it grew his love of life, of the community of life. And throughout it, he uses examples in talking about his knowledge, right, of when he knows a particular insect is boring for small larvae that it will feed its eggs, right? It helps him connect from an emotional standpoint to this larger family of life, knowing that it's trying to provide for its young ones, right? And so that essay really touches me every time. It's so heartfelt and it's so relevant, I think, to the times, as we have kind of more people who are open spiritually, as kind of the Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic religions have kind of had such a complicated history and violent history and led to environmental degradation and environmental neglect, that there's this desire to find some place that is respectful of science and yet honors the mystery and the community of life in a way that is very honest and very real to our interdependence. What does the natural world teach? And I think that goes back to this kind of storytelling component, in one of the earlier questions and responses of just, even trying to revisit Burroughs's work and revisit these ecologies in the Hudson Valley and Catskills is trying to track over time, what has changed, what has remained the same, and how we can place our own human story back into this larger story, and not just thinking it's just us or it's all me or my. And the isolation that we experience is itself kind of the root of what we're trying to kind of dismantle. And I think there's so many ways that we can do that work and connect with that reality in our own unique path. But I feel that is really the heart of the work that we're trying to do through fun and just friendship through this creative process and inquiry. And the natural world, has, maybe it's in the Gospel of Nature, John Burroughs says, everyone enters the kingdom of nature as children because they know that its repercussions for disobedience will be swift and complete. And so we all enter as children. And, it's such religious language, right? And yet I get goosebumps about it because it's like, right, you neglect a river and it will kill you. You neglect the weather of a snowstorm or whatever, lightning or falling trees or fill in the blank, right? So there's kind of just a real equality and democracy of how we engage these natural forces that I think is a really powerful place for us to meet around. And we're, as many hands and hearts and minds on deck to draw from the best of our past and re-envision what the future can be with this expanded story.
I think this is a really good place to end our conversation on. And I will definitely look for that piece of writing, The Gospel of Nature. Yeah. Indeed, it sounds like we need new ways to think about and talk about nature and the fact that we as people are a part of it, and our responsibility to nature is great because we have used and abused our natural resources, for far too long. And you're right, it's when you neglect or abuse someone, there are serious consequences and repercussions to those actions. So I really want to thank you, Eric, for talking about Burroughs, talking about birds. Thrashers are really hard to find where I am. And when I see them, it's like you just see a little bit.
That exit, that evasion, yeah.
Yeah, very evasive bird. And I wish you and Jesse all the best with completing the film.
My great pleasure. And hope you have some wonderful excursions with Burroughs' words. And looking forward to crossing paths again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Tune in on the second Thursday of next month for the next episode. In the meantime, explore our archives, like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Your Bird Story is edited and produced by Pod to the People. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.